we have a guest speaker who's going to be talking to us about this topic. We usually get guest speakers who are really well informed about these things. Tonight, I'm like particularly excited about who our guest speaker is because I have been reading her books for years, and just to prove that, for the introduction, I will just let you know from my own personal library, tonight's guest speaker is the author of books such as Against Love, Men, Notes from an Ongoing Investigation, Bound and Gagged, Unwanted Advances, and most recently and available now in the UA bookstore, Love in the Time of Contagion, which explores the concept of romance during the pandemic and how it is that it's shifted. Please give a huge round of applause for Professor at Northwestern University and total badass, Laura Kipnis. Thank you for being here tonight, Professor Kipnis.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. And by the way, consider this my audition for an on-campus visit. I love Arizona so much, and I wish I could be there.
In the future, for sure. We'll fly, that'll be great. So I know that you had a piece that you wanted to read just to get the ball rolling here with our conversation. So please have at it.
Thanks. I'm not much of a debater, but I do want to argue that we need this institution, but not for the obvious reasons. And so I did ask Ted if he'd allow me to read a couple of paragraphs from something I'm working on. And I think my role here is to inject just a little bit of irony into the proceedings. So please take this in that vein. And this is for the first time in public appearing. Okay. Coupledom is a strange invention. It's not clear that humans are particularly well suited for it, especially these days when needs are so ramped up. For example, I recall an awkward dinner with a married couple I used to be friends with. I'd known her first, then she got together with him, and the three of us hung out a lot. They seemed to like having me around either as a witness or a supplement. The dinner went sour when he wouldn't share his entree with her at a restaurant. She insisted that he'd agreed to share entrees when they'd ordered, and now halfway through the meal, she wanted to switch plates. He said he wanted his own food and refused to switch. In fact, he said it in increasingly loud tones, at which point she reached over, speared a large portion of his salmon, and placed it on her bread plate. Was this forcible tithing? Was it politics? They were both leftists. Stalin used to talk about socialism in one country. Was this socialism in one couple? He sulked throughout the rest of the meal. It was hard to know where to look. Every couple is its own political economy with complex, indecipherable systems of taxation and reparations. Or you might think, witnessing this scene, that this was a feminist moment, a woman taking her due, that she'd been cheated by life somewhere along the way, or perhaps felt she had been, and needed to get something back, even in the smallest of transactions. In fact, the opposite was true. She'd had nothing but successes in life, had gotten far more from the world than he had, perhaps been even over-promoted. His life, by contrast, had been marked by setbacks and injuries, a series of large and small humiliations. Early career promise had been followed by crippling writer's block, for which he'd entered into a decade-long psychoanalysis conducted by a malevolent Freudian who'd convinced him, he now said, under the guise of, quote, tough insights, that he was an unredeemable piece of shit. He only realized much later that he'd been in the grip of a sadist who'd relished his patient's dependency, but not until long after he'd been irreparably damaged. I could say more, but my point is that this is why we need the institution of marriage, since what would we do with our endless supply of neuroses if we didn't have spouses? So I hope that sets us up for an interesting discussion, and thank you for letting me read that.
Thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate it. I think that actually does set us up for an interesting discussion, especially because having just finished your newest book over the past weekend, I know that you've been speaking for years, ever since at the very least Against Love, about this sort of the exact controversy that we're discussing tonight, which is how much we actually need marriage and what exactly we mean when we're part of that. I know a huge part of your book, and this will probably be relevant to our attendees tonight, who are, I think, mostly college-age students. I know a large portion of your book is dedicated to this sort of generational divide, and I would love to sort of talk to you a little bit about what you see in terms of Generation Z and to a lesser extent millennials, and what degree of optimism you see in that generation with regard to marriage, because obviously there's a sort of friction between things like hookup culture and Tinder and Bumble, who actually is our sponsor tonight, versus, as you describe, a sort of reticence to kind of get involved in intimacy as a result of things like the pandemic and also things like post-Me Too. So if you could talk a little bit about what you see the relationship of Gen Z to monogamy is, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, one of the chapters in the book actually is based on a series of interviews I did with a former student of mine, so who is, a millennial, but had graduated maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and who is a queer, Black, millennial, very online. I call her Zelda in the book. And one of the good things that happened during the pandemic, I mean, there weren't a lot of good things, but one was Zoom. And, you develop these kind of weird intimacies online with people you wouldn't necessarily have become as intimate with. And Zelda, being a millennial and being very online, like really, really liked talking about her love life. And I was fascinated by it. And one of the things that I learned, and this might be familiar to you in the audience, is that she and the people that she was getting involved with, and she was doing a lot of online dating and hooking up even during the lockdown. But the amazing thing to me was how much it was like her love life was playing out almost like in the context of a village, in public view, because everything she and her dates and girlfriends did, they posted online. So there was this constant like drama being stirred up via digital means, the text, Twitters, Facebook, and actually not Facebook, Instagram, and this thing I learned about Finsta, which is secret Instagram accounts where people post things about their relationships, just for a small circle of friends, but anonymously. But the point was, in the chapter is called Love and Chaos. I mean, that the people in her circle who all knew each other and all hooked up with each other and were conducting intel on each other and were all jealous of each other's past and, constantly spending their days scrolling through each other's posts, looking for receipts and, things to shame people about and screenshotting and posting the screenshots, people deleting stuff and blocking people. It just was this constant drama. And it did remind me, for people who have maybe taken an English class, it reminded me of a novel like Middlemarch, which is, about a 19th century village where everybody's love life or marriages play out before the community, and the community is passing judgments on everyone's life. So it's both like hyper online and up to the moment, but also kind of weirdly this throwback to the 19th century where, I think we have this loss of privacy or decline of what we used to think of before social media, maybe as privacy, and that your love life played out in private, and now I think we're back to this way in the 19th century where everything was for the public and for the commentary of the village. So that's one way of talking about it.
Well, I'm wondering, because that's a good point, and I'm wondering, that's kind of where my curiosity about newer generations' sort of relationship to intimacy is, because intimacy traditionally is, knowing private things about your partner and knowing each other in ways that nobody else knows you. But does intimacy even exist anymore in a world where everything is continually sort of like made into a public sphere?
Well, I said that their relationship, particularly one that she had with a girlfriend, where there was kind of like no boundaries between them. And the girlfriend really wanted to know everything and go through her phone, and, there could be no secrets. I said that it reminded me of going through one of those full body scanners, TSA scanners at the airport, and, I think there is this way, like particularly post 9/11, that we all have been asked to give up our privacy. I know your students are probably remembering those pre 9/11 times when there was far more of a sense of privacy and far more of a sense because we weren't carrying these tracking devices around with us all the time, i.e. our phones. I think there is a way that both like in the political sphere, in terms of the state, we're constantly under surveillance. And now in our private lives, we've almost, and I thought this about her circle of friends, they were almost like making an art form or a performance art form out of there being no privacy and everything being public. And so even their intimate lives, were like subjected to these codes of you must reveal all. And there are older notions, and I talked about this advice manual, this marriage advice manual from the 1930s, where the guy says, who wrote it, says, you need to have some secrets from your partner. And he's very against this idea of people revealing all to each other because you need a sphere of privacy from your mate. I mean, there is this kind of common wisdom, like we need to have some mystery in a relationship. Well, I could see with these in her circle, in Zelda's circle, there just really was not a concept of privacy, and privacy to want to maintain some was considered to be like something of a betrayal.
I want to. So I'm glad that you brought up this idea of sort of having secrets from your partner, because another idea that I know that you bring up a lot, again, both in this book and also in Against Love, is the concept of adultery. And I want to just throw that out because I'm sure that's going to come up during our conversation tonight. Because you talk about it in a very complicated way, in the way that it's obviously incredibly taboo, but you also suggest that it's a lot more common than we ever sort of like to admit. And so I know that the way that you describe it in your newest book is a divide between our sort of instinct to simultaneously stay and flee. So I wanted to get your ideas about how does adultery sort of enters into the concept of marriage, and whether it's proof that we actually are really committed because of that instinct to stay, or whether it's proof of the failure of the institution of marriage because of our instinct to flee, and how it is that kind of comes in.
I mean, all of that, yes. When presented with an either or, I always like to say yes. So I had written this book Against Love. It's now almost, it's a couple of decades ago. And I mean, for one thing, it was written before cell phones, before you could track your partner's movements all day long. And I was very interested in the ways that people who were in these long-term couples, where maybe like desire had sort of left, but they were still committed because of property or children. I mean, maybe people in the audience can think of their parents' marriages as opposed to their own relationships, where people have been together for quite a while. And I was interested in this idea that adultery was like this form of resistance, like a kind of rebellion, this cadre of covert rebels, in the suburbs, rebelling against these norms and strictures of domesticity, and kind of playing around, rejecting the work ethic of marriage. The good marriages take work, and like why, and I describe that as overwork. Like, why should relationships take so much work? Like, don't we work all day? Do we have to go home and work some more? So yeah, I've always been interested in that ambivalence, and sort of the kind of like elephant in the room elements of our lives. And the elephant in the room in that case that I was talking about was this, for many people, fact that desire, like erotic desire, sexual desire, libido, doesn't persist as long as a long-term marriage is expected to persist. I mean, people talk about the 7-year itch, I don't know, maybe it's now the 3-year itch or something. But I also do think at the current moment, in a way, I think things have tightened up more since I wrote that book. I mean, I think that adultery is actually seen as almost far more taboo and more of a betrayal than it was when I wrote Against Love.
Yeah, I was gonna say before, I know that you do make the case that it's a sort of almost a political stance again, to resist the strictures of commitment, but I do see, weirdly enough, in a lot of my students now and people that I speak to who are in Generation Z, because of things like hookup culture, it almost feels like monogamy is in a lot of ways like a political stance against sort of what's in the culture now. I think about that a lot. Especially, I got married last month, so I think about that a lot. And right now, my wife and I are rewatching Mad Men, where there's a lot of adultery in pretty much every single episode of that show. So I just want to just talk about just two more questions before I let you go. So another thing that you talk about, obviously, is relationships during the time of the pandemic. And I'd love to sort of get your take on how it is that you think that the pandemic either shifted our ideas about relationships and marriage and long-term commitment, or whether it brought out things that were sort of like always underneath the surface, whether it brought people together, whether it tore them apart. What are we talking about here? And I'm sure, again, the answer is probably yes to all of that, right?
I mean, I think it's in a way too soon to know really how it's shifted things for us. But I was interested in the way, thinking back to like AIDS and HIV, really changing sexual culture, and this was back in the 80s, mid 80s when it kind of started. And, this was following this period of a lot of, the sexual revolution, openness and freedom. And I think there was a real shift towards seeing sex as something like more potentially traumatic or injurious. And, I could see this in my own students, like they had much more of a sort of moralistic and kind of often negative attitude towards sex than I think I had, or people my age had at that same age. And I did think it was the result of the kind of post-AIDS sex education, where sex used to be considered almost kind of healthful, and now is seen as more dangerous and possibly injurious. But I think that also that more kind of moralistic and fearful attitude towards sex also competes with a kind of ethos. And I wrote of the hookup culture ethos. And I wrote about this a lot in my last book, Unwanted Advances, subtitle Sexual Paranoia Comes to Campus, which was about campus culture now. And I think just the real conflict between these competing impulses. And I, again, saw this in my own students. But as far as the pandemic, I mean, I do think that, in the same way that the virus and the pandemic kind of was like a microscope on American culture and American politics and the kind of inequities, longstanding inequities, and exposed so much and about the healthcare system. I mean, I do think that it also kind of turned a microscope on our relationships, and particularly for people who had been in long-term relationships and were sheltering with a partner. I think it did expose and perhaps bring out like certain kinds of ruptures and fractures that might not have been seen if people weren't forced into these dependencies on each other far more. People were shut up together on a long-term basis, with another person or in a family. And I think that did bring a lot of emotional stuff out in the open that had been able to be suppressed.
I want to plug back into something you said earlier, and it's my last question, and it's partly a selfish one because it's something I wanted to long ask you. But I know that you had mentioned there is a part in Unwanted Advances where you talk about, because you teach film, where in one of your classes you were teaching the opposite of sex, and some of your students were being a bit moralistic about the characters' sexual choices, and one of them shouts, "Well, yes, sex can kill you, right? That it's dangerous." But I think this actually sort of speaks to what we're going to be talking about tonight, which is in your new book, you talk about sort of the stories that we tell ourselves about our sex lives and about commitment and about marriage in general. really kind of relay themselves into our behaviors and how it is that we actually engage in those things. So I'd love to just ask you, do you feel as though this, like the media that we watch, like the films that we watch, the books that we read, do you think that that's sort of shifting and that it's infecting this new sort of way of viewing sex and commitment relationships? Do you think it's infecting those narratives, and then in effect those narratives are affecting how it is that we are sort of like moving about our daily lives?
That's an interesting question, but as somebody who has taught film for so long, I mean, what you see, talking to a class full of students is, people make what they need to make out of the things that they watch. And, I'm sure you know this, and probably everybody in the audience knows this, you can see something that you're watching like, completely differently than the other person, somebody sitting next to you who may be superficially like have the same demographic profile. So,
I'm literally teaching that in my class right now. Yeah.
Pardon?
I'm literally teaching that in my class right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we do write the scripts of our lives individually, oftentimes based on the media that we're watching. And like one of the fun things about writing that book, Love in the Time of Contagion, was I was watching all of this stuff like Indian matchmaking, on TV, or these serial killer movies, which are often about these weird intimacies that spring up between the serial killer and the detective pursuing the serial killer. So you're watching those things, and like to me, that was a big metaphor for, relationships. I don't know if other people saw it that way, but, I made everything I was watching into a kind of parable of my own life. And I kind of assume everybody else was doing that.
Yeah, and Love is Blind, which it just premiered its second season, so we can all watch that together after this. Well, I really appreciate this, Laura. This was great. And if we can get one last big, huge hand for Professor Laura Kipnis.
Oh, thank you. Next time in person, Ted.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Have a good debate, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Let's get started with our actual debate proper, where we're going to be discussing, as you know, the debate of whether or not the institution of marriage is dead. Again, if you haven't been to one of these debates before, this is how the whole entire thing is going to work. We're going to have a vote beforehand to find out what it is that people in the audience think of this particular resolution, whether you are in favor of or against the idea that the institution of marriage is dead. Then we're going to hear opening statements from our debaters. They're going to get a chance to talk to each other, answer my questions, and answer your questions, so you're welcome to ask whatever questions you want to during the second round. We'll have very brief closing statements, and then you've got to vote again. And the winners of our debate tonight will be determined by who ends up getting the most votes, ends up switching the vote the most from the beginning to the end, rather than who gets the most votes. So it's who's changing your mind the most, rather than who just gets the largest audience vote. So Naya's going to come up here in just a minute. She's going to let us know how it is that you can take the preliminary vote. So if you get your cell phones out, Naya is going to direct you toward Kahoot. All good? Okay. All right, excellent. So now that we have our preliminary vote, we can open up our very brief opening statements. Usually they're a little bit longer, but we wanted to allow Professor Kipnis to go on as long as we needed her to. So that said, let's open up our debate. And opening up the debate on the affirmative side of the resolution that the institution of marriage is indeed dead, we have Jacob.
Before we begin, we would like to thank our guest speaker, Professor Laura Kipnis, our moderator, Ted McCloof, the negative team, Brian and Ananya, and the audience for providing us the opportunity to discuss the institution of marriage. We would also like to establish some common definitions both teams have agreed upon to serve as a framework to understand this debate. We define the institution of marriage as a valued principle within society. We define dead as that society has moved away from a collective agreement that marriage is a net benefit for us all. And that we define marriage as two people living together and a faithful, long-term committed relationship. Now, for those of you that voted against us, we understand where you are coming from. We are not saying that marriage has no value. I am sure there are people in this audience who will readily attest to how beautiful and wonderful a marriage can be. But remember, we are debating the value of marriage not to ourselves, but to society. And it is essential to keep in mind that what is good, right, and perfect for our lives is not necessarily good, right, and perfect for everyone else. We will talk later in the debate about how support for the institution of marriage overall in our society has declined over the last several decades, reaching the lowest level in recorded history. And the primary indicator of this is that fewer people than ever are married. And there are two primary causes for this. First off, people are deciding to get married later in life than previous generations. We are past the days where every marriage was a nuclear family, with the dad getting the job right out of high school and the mom being the housewife. Women are entering the career force in greater numbers than ever, and more people are choosing to enter careers that require more time and more sacrifice to achieve it. And these factors, along with others, are the reasons that more people are deciding to value their career over getting married early. And secondly, and more importantly, more people are deciding they never want to get married. Some of you, when you hear this, you'll think, well, they've just had a bad experience with relationships. That's all it is. We are not talking about that. We are talking about people who have rationally concluded that marriage is not the best thing for their life. And there are several entirely valid reasons that people could conclude that either with someone or by themselves, they can live a happy, fulfilled, and satisfied life outside of the institution of marriage. We are not talking about domestic partnerships, where people are married in spirit, but just without the contract. We are talking about the societal value of the spirit of marriage, of two people living together for a long time in a faithful, committed manner. We will bring up later in the debate the book Going Solo, which describes some of the social benefits of staying single and how being single does not automatically mean being alone. In fact, you heard our guest speaker, an expert on this subject, bring up the point that we are not particularly suited as a species to a relationship, that sometimes it is better for us just to be single. If we want you to remember only one thing to keep in mind for this debate, remember that the institution of marriage being alive is more than just any one of our individual experiences. It is about the value we place on it as a society. We should not take what is good and right and perfect for our lives and automatically assume it will do the same for everyone else. And people, for a variety of reasons, are moving on. So what we ask is, the next time you think about the institution of marriage and marriage as a whole, your first question should not be when you should get married or even who you should marry. Your first question should be why you should get married, and if so, why? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jake. Okay, and opening up the debate on the negative side of the resolution, that the institution of marriage is dead, we have Ananya.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight, and if it's not too late, happy Valentine's Day. Before starting, I would like to bring it to everyone's attention that we, at all times, are not in support of abusive or fraudulent marriages. My teammate and I would like to add something to the definition of marriage. We define marriage as a formal union and a social and legal contract between two people as partners that unites their lives legally, economically, and emotionally. Love isn't just an emotion, it's a decision, a commitment that marriage puts a seal on. With the changing times, I must say, the norms of marriages are also changing. However, its basic essence and traditionality still remains intact. With career-oriented individuals striving for financial stability, the median age at marriage has gone up. But this does not reflect that people don't want marriages. There's no question that people are getting married later in life, but most still get married eventually. Even when you look at the divorce rates, the graph is upward sloping. However, if you look at it over a period of time, the overall rate of increase is declining. The divorce rate peaked in the early 1970s and 1980s, has been declining for the 3 decades since. This appears to me, if anything, the institution of marriage is getting stronger. Marriages come with their own set of challenges. They ask you to be responsible and mature. It builds pressure when your actions consequently affect somebody else's. But aren't challenges what makes life fun? Moreover, marriages give you the courage to push yourself and give your best till the end, because now giving up isn't just that easy. And come on, how difficult can something be when you have somebody beside you 24/7 selflessly? Marriage is a contract, having communication, trust, and companionship as its foundation. Partners pose challenges for each other all the time. And if it weren't for this solid contract, people would just give up easily. Marriages keep you from running away and grow together as companions and daring each other to do better. As John Green said, and I quote, "The pleasure isn't in owning the person, it's in that having another competitor in the room." The sweetness and sourness of this institution are what keeps it alive and interesting. After all, too much sugar can give you diabetes. Marriages can sometimes be stressful, I agree. When there are 2 vessels in a room, they will make noise. I think it is unrealistic to expect 2 people to have same opinions, preferences, and choices at all times. Marriage isn't love at first sight. It's a journey of exploring each other, working through highs and lows together, and making compromises just in the name of love. Marriage isn't about giving up your identity or your personal space either. It is always a happy addition. Even in modern society, when people love their individuality, they demand marriages. In several countries, queer community is fighting for their right to marry even after their acceptance of love. My conclusion from this is that acceptance of love is just not enough. People need more, they want marriages and be recognized legally. Makes sense, after all, to love someone is to identify with them. Not just for us as individuals, marriages are important for the functioning of society, economy, and for posterity. Mountains of research tell us that children reared outside intact marriages are much more likely than other kids to slip into poverty, become victims of child abuse, fail at school and drop out, experience other signs of mental illness, and commit crimes. Statistically, higher levels of marriage are strongly correlated with more state GDP per capita, greater levels of upward economic mobility, lower levels of child poverty, and higher median family incomes. Families with stronger ties are likely to report higher level of happiness and satisfaction. Indeed, they can make you happy in a way no one else can. Inclination to marry also comes from religion. Faith encourages marital permanence and fidelity. Religions propose marriage as an important step towards union of 2 souls at a spiritual level. They theorize that each person is a component of 2 people, and this life is about locating your other half. Over the centuries, beliefs about marriages are evolving and new definitions and forms are being introduced, such as open marriages and living apart together marriages. Society is constantly evolving, and with them are norms about marriage. But the institution is still there and shall continue to exist till we are capable of loving. I would mark an end to my words by saying, we don't know what's best for us. So when we find love, we should just grab whatever chances we have of happiness. Life is too short to not take risks. It is too short to not go all in. And marriage is all in for love. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ananya. Those were excellent. I feel that was a hell of a start. Okay, let's get started. And as usual, let me pose my first question over to the affirmative, since the negative just spoke. And I think it's actually really important that it sounds like your opponents are very, very specifically talking about. They are excusing the idea of they're not discussing things like abusive marriages. But they are absolutely, it sounds like, owning the idea that marriage sometimes comes with its complications, and sometimes it can come with its contradictions and compromises. But they're suggesting those are all good things. So can I throw my first question over to you, which is, would you agree, I would assume not, that marriages, that the compromises that come along with marriages, the compromises that you have to make as opposed to being single, as you said before, Jacob, are not necessarily good things?
I guess kind of our best response for that is that in some relationships, that those conflicts and those issues can help you become stronger, become a better person, but that's on an individual case-by-case basis. That for some people, those conflicts and those contradictions, and that, as you said, your competitor in the room, it can be too strong. That, think about it, you've had a stressful day, you've been dealing with hard issues and hard problems and conflicts your entire life, your entire day. So you just want to come home and be able to relax and not be in endless fights. So I guess my best response to that would be, it can, in some situations, the conflict can make you stronger, but it can also break you depending on the relationship.
Okay, so Jay, do you want to follow? Let me transition that over here, because I know you had mentioned the idea that it's not about giving up personal space in a marriage, but it sounds like Jacob is arguing the opposite. He's suggesting that it leaves less room to be able to come home from a stressful day and be able to sort of decompress on your own. Can you talk a little bit about why it is that you don't believe that marriage is ends up giving up our personal space? Yeah, Brent.
That's why when you marry, it is important to choose who you marry. It depends on, there's many factors. First, back then it used to start with what type of family does this person come from? What goals does this person have in life? What interests do we have in common? So it depends. And yes, abusive marriages exist. It all starts with raising your voice. And it can end, sometimes it can end your life, and that's why there's many people who do not want to marry. But that does not mean that the institution of marriage is dead. It is worth finding love, trying to have someone to spend the rest of your life with.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I guess, yes, I would agree. In an ideal world, you find the perfect person that even with the conflicts, you're able to work through them and become strong with each other. But that's the ideal world, and we're not living in the ideal world. We're living in reality, and sometimes you're just not going to find the right person for you, no matter how hard you look and no matter how long you go. And that if we have this social pressure of automatically seeing marriage as always a good thing for everybody, that pressure can lead people to be forced into relationships with the wrong person, and that end up leading to a worse life than if they had just stayed single.
I think the foundation for marriage that I stated even in my speech is communication. A lot of problems arise when there's a communication gap. If you don't want to talk sometime, you can just say that you don't want to talk, and communication can just solve like half of the problems. So I think, yeah, communication is the key, and that's the foundation of marriage.
I'll give you one last response, and then I want to send my second question over to you.
I guess I would agree that communication can help resolve things, but there's some people, I think we could all agree, it's not like you can just talk through all your issues if you just married some random person, that there's a sense of you can talk through things, but you're not always going to be able to resolve it, no matter how hard you try.
And I think if you're in a relationship, it's not always going to be your side that wins. Sometimes you have to compromise. And it's a series of compromises that two individuals make to make things work.
I'm glad that you pointed that out. So my second question is over to you guys. It's kind of off of that. And in your estimation, both of you, what would you say, how would it best be for people to decide and determine who a productive partner might be? Somebody who how do you tell whether or not you are good at communicating? What is the way to figure that out prior to getting married? Prior to figuring that out?
Brian really wants to answer this. I'm going to give it to him. But before that, I have a really nice quote by Jane Austen, and I really want to bring it up. It's not time or opportunity that is to determine intimacy. It is disposition alone. 7 years would be insufficient to make some people acquainted with each other, and 7 days are more than enough for others.
I will. I mean, as an English professor, I'll always allow a Jane Austen quote. Yeah, Brian, go for it.
There's something I want to mention. You do not stop knowing the person. You keep knowing more of the person, while you're in marriage. There's a misconception that, oh, I got it all set up. I know everything of this person. But you will see the person developing. Marriage is a development. It develops over time. But another thing is it's a compromise. It's a union. But people change throughout time. Feelings change. So I would say it usually is a mystery, because you do not stop knowing someone.
So your suggestion here is that you can't necessarily determine how well you can communicate with someone at the beginning, because communication is something that you can develop and build over time.
I guess I kind of have a question for that. Is going on that line of reasoning, when would you know that you're just not right for the person, or do you just assume that you'll never be able to know that for the rest of your life because you can always learn more about the person? I guess when's your kind of in your idea, like, I'm not talking about abusive relationships here. I'm just talking about when you have two good people who just don't get along.
Like when is the time to call it?
Yeah,
quits?
Or do you just assume that you're always going to learn something, so there's always the chance and you should just not get divorced?
Marriage does not devalue divorce. Divorce is also healthy. It depends on case to case, but I think someone that marries mostly because they love the person, or because they want stability in their life, or because they want to have someone to spend their life with. Correct?
I'm not waiting on this. Yeah, if you guys want to respond.
Yeah, I mean, we agree that, having that one person to spend the rest of your life with and truly grow is a good thing. But what we're saying here is that doesn't necessarily work for everybody. At the end of the day, you can only know so much about a person before you're just like, well, we should, separate. We should split paths. We're just not meant for each other. We're not arguing necessarily against that it works for some people. Even in our opening arguments, we said that you can't just say that marriage is a definitively good thing based on some person's relationship.
I'll let you respond, and then I'm gonna turn over to you guys, and then we'll turn to audience questions after that. So if you have questions, have them ready to go.
I think it is important for people to love themselves before they love someone else. And the reason why I'm saying that is because how much are you going to tolerate, right? There's many abusive relationships out there. And the reason why many people think the institution of marriage is dead, because there was a lot of enslavement through marriage. Back then, women, or usually women, that was it. You were either a housewife, a nurse, a teacher, and that's something that many people disagree with now. There is a lot of options now. Society has changed, but many cultures have not changed that. Some people view women as, oh, you just belong in the kitchen. Now, women.
But Brian, it sounds like you're making a pretty strong argument for your opponent's side that marriage has a lot of that still has a lot of antiquated notions about gender roles. It sounds like you're suggesting that these are all sort of negatives now, or are you arguing in favor of those things? You're bringing up an awful lot of bad things about marriage for someone who's arguing in favor of the idea of marriage.
It's because you cannot hide the fact that many people have experienced that being in favor of marriage does not mean that you have to be blind to the negative aspects of it. But is it worth marrying? Yes, many people want to have someone to spend with when they're old. They want to build an empire with someone. They want a team.
Okay. Yeah.
I guess I kind of had a question on an earlier comment you made about, you were talking about that when you enter a relationship, you should enter it from because you love the person and because you want to spend your life with them. But you also mentioned that people can change. So I guess the question I have for you then is, if you enter a relationship and you love someone, but then things change and not in an abusive way, but you just realize you're not right for them, do you assume that things can change again and then you can love them again? Or when do you decide that I am not going to love this person and I should leave them?
And I'll let you respond for your side, and then we'll move to our next question, and then we'll go to audience questions.
I think when I say marriage, I just don't say like you meet somebody and you marry them instantly. I think there are several processes. I'm coming from India, and even in arranged marriages, they give you time to know each other and decide whether you will be able to spend your rest of your life with them. So I think marriage is the end result. But before date, you should totally date. You should totally decide like if that person, you can actually spend your life with that person, and then you should decide on marriage.
Let me throw my next question over here, because we're talking an awful lot about the benefits and deficits of marriage. But Jacob, you mentioned earlier in your opening speech that there are also benefits and deficits to singlehood. So if I could sort of direct my next question to what is it that the two of you see as particularly beneficial about singlehood, and especially things that you get from being single that you don't get necessarily from a committed marriage? And then we'll turn to audience.
I guess kind of the rationale behind it is sometimes there's this perception that, like I referenced in my opening speech, that if you're not with somebody, you're alone. And the thing is, especially with all of our very busy lives, with all the tasks that we have to do, that time is a very precious commodity that if sometimes when you're in a relationship, yes, you can have a very good relationship with that person, but that can come at the expense of other friends or other relationships that you could develop in place of that. So I guess kind of the benefit would be gaining other friendships and gaining other experiences that you wouldn't have the time for necessarily if you were in a marriage.
Response? I mean, is there a sort of divided attention that you might have if you are in a marriage where you can't dedicate your time to these other places, or do you disagree with that notion?
I think the time is never a waste. I think it's always an investment that you put in to know each other, and so that you can adjust yourself according to each other's preferences.
I mean, we agree that it's an investment, but at the end of the day, there's only 24 hours in a day. You spend a decent part of that sleeping, hopefully, and you have, other things going on in your life. At the end of the day, you have to kind of decide what you want to invest in. You shouldn't be automatically assuming like dating for marriage is going to be the best for you. You should have a decent amount of flexibility in your life to, be single and pursue other things to grow yourself.
I agree that sleep is peaceful, but isn't belongingness as peaceful as it?
I mean, being lonely, again, isn't necessarily a bad thing, and we wouldn't argue that being alone is lonely in the first place. You can be perfectly fulfilled outside of a marriage. Many people are. That's why we've seen it decline over the past couple decades.
I mean, a couple comments on that. First off, when I was referencing the support for marriage has declined, it's a survey from the Gallup poll, which has happened over decades, and it's described that currently 39% of Americans view the institution of marriage as obsolete, which is the lowest level the Gallup poll has ever recorded. And I guess kind of the other comment is, think about something in your life right now that you're really passionate about, that you want to chase and have a career in, but maybe you're just not able to find the partner or the spouse that is willing to support you and make the sacrifices to go along with you, so that you might have to make that decision, well, do I choose my spouse and then end up with a less beneficial career, or do I choose my career and then stay single? And that depending on the person, that the career could be more valuable depending how passionate they are for it and how valuable it can be to society. So I guess taking the marriage route and making the sacrifices can be beneficial for some people, but that's not the right thing for everyone.
But I think that's where communication comes in. If you are in a good relationship and if you would communicate that to your partner, they will understand. Why will they not understand? Why will they not support you? That's what marriage is about, supporting and growing together.
I mean, you can only communicate yourself out of so many situations to the point where you just have to recognize maybe the relationship isn't working. You can't just communicate yourself and just say, I'm speaking my truth and hear your partner and just be like, well, I guess this is solved now.
Let's get some questions from the audience. Who's got some questions for our debaters up here? Yeah, great.
So to just what you were saying right there about you can't communicate yourself.
Who's this forward side?
Oh, on the right side. You can't communicate yourself out of any or out of everything. But they were saying earlier that there are times where maybe force is the correct answer, and they weren't saying that it wasn't. But wouldn't having healthy communication be a part of that? And in any instance, it's not always a resolution we both agree upon it, but being able to communicate is part of being healthy, or communicating to the point of realizing that divorce would be the optimal solution.
It's a great question.
I guess kind of the response is we're absolutely in agreement that communication is very essential for any relationship, especially a marriage. But I guess what we're more saying is I feel like this is kind of what you were referencing to, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's that some issues, depending on the values of the individual people in the relationship, but depending on their life experiences and what shapes them as a person and what they see as important, sometimes you just will come to fundamentally different disagreements. For example, if you have growing up in a community where your spouse's family lives there and that's very, very important to them, but you have a job on the other side of the country that's very, very important to you, and no matter how much you talk about it, you are dead set on going to that job, and that it is far too important for them to stay near their family. So yes, you can communicate for that, but you can't automatically communicate and fix every issue.
Can I? Yeah. So that's what I said. Like, you don't have to marry someone instantly. You date, you try to understand them. And I think that's the right space where you communicate what you expect from your life and what the other one expects from their life. And that's when you decide that if you want to marry that person or not.
But I guess the comment is, it's something you said earlier about even during the marriage, people can keep changing. I guess where we're kind of disagreeing with that is, yes, we're agreeing that dating can be a useful way to get to know if you should marry someone, but it's not a certain automatically that after this period of dating, I know I want to be with the person for the rest of my life, because both people involved in the relationship will keep changing over life. And your value placed in the marriage, at one time, you might think it's the right thing, and later on, it might not.
Then you make big compromises.
Let's get another question from the audience. Yeah, in the side.
Me? Yeah. So I have a lot of friends that are getting married right now. I'm just wondering, what is the benefit to making it like a legal union instead of just staying together long term, raising a family? I have this conversation a lot with my friends, and the only answer I get is that you get a tax break. I mean, what is the benefit to making it legally a union instead of,
I actually don't even still know whether you get a tax break. We're still figuring that out. But yeah, I assume this is for these guys. So let's find out. Yeah, what is the benefit of actually getting married versus?
Well, to many people, it is a sensation of making it official. To many people, that's why they do it.
And also, there's a lot of financial stability that one person, if he wants to do something in their life at a later stage, there's somebody to support them. And also, like the data suggests, family grown with two parents, the children are more prosperous, they have better paying jobs, and they're financially and mentally more stable.
So stability, support, things like that.
If I can respond to that, I think there's 2 points I want to bring up in relation to your question and the response. The first is when my opponents brought up the indication that it brings financial stability. A lot of these things, such as your friends who are mostly getting married for tax benefits, what you see is that that's not necessarily based in financial stability, whereas it ends up causing more financial dependency. You're going into a relationship, specifically the union of marriage, not necessarily because like say you want to be in that relationship, but also because you're getting a tax break. And then the second point I wanted to bring up briefly was my opponents brought up that it was, it has like good long-term effects for children. Again, I would like to single out that they said strongly correlated. That doesn't necessarily mean they are actually tied together in any meaningful way. But I'd also like to kind of lead on to the fact that, having a marriage between two people, whether it gives financial benefits or relationship benefits, it's not necessarily the best outcome for the individual.
Could I ask you a very quick question of the two sides? Because I think that this is probably an important thing. I don't know if I have a good way of defining these two words, but what is the difference, because you brought it up, Trevor, between dependence and codependence? In other words, like unhealthy dependence on a partner to the point where you're far too reliant on them, versus, as you guys are suggesting, a support system where it's good to be able to rely on each other. There's an entire chapter on this actually in Laura Kipnis' book, which again you should all get. But you guys want to take that question on? Where's the line drawn between unhealthy dependence and healthy dependence?
I think the healthy dependence is something when like both the partners agree and mutually share resources, whereas unhealthy dependence is when it's just like a trap, and like one of the partner, they just doesn't want to work and they're lazy, and everything falls on just one person, and it kind of builds like frustration in the marriages. So yeah, I think that's where the line is.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Is that, Dana, are you trying to mark the camera, or do you have a question? Okay, we'll get to Dana's question after this, and then we can wrap up and go to.
I think unhealthy dependence is also when, for example, one of the partners buys you everything, provides everything for you, and the other partner does not have a career. So the person is trapped to the resources that the other partner, the spouse, provides to him or her.
And what you guys are suggesting wouldn't happen in a healthy, communicative kind of relationship.
Exactly. And then another thing, there's a traditional perception of marriage that the man is the head of the house, right? I think for a marriage to last, to be strong, it's for both male, female, both spouses to unite and make it a teamwork. For example, if your mother tells, your wife tells the children, no, you cannot play there. But then the father says, oh no, you can. That's an unhealthy relationship. But it is important for both to come to agreement. That's why when you marry, you define those factors.
Let's get our final question. Dane, what were you going to ask?
Okay, first, to get the tax benefit, you have to be making way more than your partner for it to make sense. So if you're making about the same money, it doesn't matter. Yeah, okay. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but yeah, there is a correlation between married couples and prosperity of children, but there's a stronger correlation between household income and children. So, I mean, like, they've shown that, like, if you have a rich single parent, your kids have about the same chance as, like, a kid who has two parents who make half of what you do. So, I mean, that sort of makes it more clear that, like, I think it's more economics than the family unit that's important there. And if that is the case, then wouldn't it make more sense to be arguing for, say, polyamory, polygamy?
So can I twist that into a question that can sort of be a kind of binary, and then we'll get to our closing statements after that. Where does the concept of economics enter into this entire debate here? Where does economic stability or your professional life enter into singlehood versus into married life?
I guess part of the way it would factor into it is, given how much of our life depends on money and our stability, like having a house, being able to provide for our family, that can have a significant impact on the stability. I guess another thing I'd also like to highlight about talking about the correlation between the high levels of marriage and the benefits for children, that's predicated on the assumption that the marriages are good, which that can be the case, but that's like really what we're going back to is it's not always true for everybody. And we're not talking about abusive relationships. We're just talking about people who don't get along. So then if you have kids grow up in a house where the parents are always bickering and fighting and complaining and leaving a hostile environment for the kids to grow up in with a twisted sense of what a relationship can be, that I feel that it's in the end going to be far more harmful than just having a single supportive parent who can help guide their kid on the right path.
Walking a little bit away from the initial question about economy and its relationship to these things, can you guys respond to that initial question?
Yeah, I think the statistics already suggest that like high level of marriages are strongly correlated with more state GDP per capita, greater levels of upward economic mobility, lower levels of child poverty, and higher median family incomes. And I think one possible reason for this is human resource. When humans are happy and satisfied, they are more productive, and I think that's one reason marriages provide stability, satisfaction, and happiness, and that's what makes humans more productive and leads to economic development and growth.
Okay, excellent. Let's close out our second round. And let's move on to our third round, which again, we are going to have incredibly brief, 2-minute long closing statements, and then we will move to our final vote to find out where it is that you guys all land. And again, let's start out with our closing statement from the affirmative side of the idea that the institution of marriage is indeed dead, in which we have Trevor.
All right. Before I begin, again, I would just like to thank Professor Laura Kipnis for introing us into this important discussion, my opponents for coming here and debating us, my partner, Ted, for helping set this up, and all of you guys for coming to watch us still in the pandemic. So that being said, I'd like to begin right about now. We'd agree with our opponents in the sense that you do need to be happy and satisfied to properly raise children and to properly handle yourself. But what we argue, and what we argued in our case, is that you don't need to be in a marriage to do that. You can do that by yourself. In fact, there's a lot of benefits to being alone. Just to go off of that, just to kind of restate what we said in our opening, is that fewer people are married now than ever before, and a lot of people see marriage as something that is institutionally dead. We can't discount their belief. What we see is that there are reasons for that, not just marriages that have become abusive, but people on the day-to-day life are just deciding marriages just aren't for them, and there's nothing wrong with that. Finally, I'd like to say, kind of almost in a rebuttal to the John Green quote, which is someone I also love, is that it is important to have a competitor in the room, but it doesn't need to be someone who you are financially and legally tied to for a significant amount of time. It can be anybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you for sticking to time. And finally, closing out not only the negative side of this resolution, but the entire debate itself, we have Brian.
First, I would like to thank everyone for attending this debate. I personally think marriage is essential for our society as a whole. Throughout centuries, many people have decided to form a union and spend the rest of their lives with a partner. The reason why many people are married is because they want a partner in life. They want to form a family, someone to form an empire. And like on my opponent's side, many people find it just fine not being married and being together. But that does not mean that it's for everyone. Many people find a lot of value in marriage because it's more purposeful. It's more purposeful. It's more meaningful. It's saying you want to spend the rest of your life with that person that you choose. Another thing I want to clarify is that we do not support abusive marriages, and we do not support marriages that are forced. Many people throughout centuries have suffered that. Children, there are a lot of children in married families, that have suffered the abuse from their parents. And I think it's important for people to decide to know which partner they choose in life. It's important to know who you marry. But before I close this statement, I think it is worth marrying someone, and I think love is a life. That's my closing statement. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Brian. All right, Naya's going to come up here and let you guys know how you can close out your Kahoot and give your final vote. Determine which side you agree with, either the affirmative or the negative, whether you think that marriage is indeed dead or whether it's not.
Okay, yeah. Same code as before. If you guys logged out, if you didn't log out, that would be great. And if you guys could just re-vote after this debate, if you believe the institution of marriage is dead, it'll be the same colors as before: red for yes, blue for no, yellow for undecided, though we hope that you're still not undecided after seeing this whole debate.
All right, now I'm going to write the final results up there. While she does that, I want to just say one more time, thank you all for coming tonight. Thanks to all four of our debaters. We have our next two debates that are going to be coming up later on this semester. At the end of March, if you follow our social media, we'll announce our dates and our times. At the end of March, we're going to be discussing journalism and the importance of fact-checking on social media with news reports. Our special 420 debate is going to be on legalizing drugs, so you should definitely come to that. At the end of the semester, we're going to have our statewide tournament, the Regents Cup, held up in Flagstaff, between ASU, NAU, and U of A, which hopefully we're going to kick ass at this year and super win. But again, you should definitely go out and buy Laura Kipnis' book, Love and Time of Contagion. It is a real page turner. That said, Matt, do you have our work?
Yeah, I do. So before the debate, we had 39% of you said that the institution of marriage is indeed dead. 48% of you said that the institution of marriage was not dead, and 13% were undecided. After the debate, we had 50% of you saying that the institution of marriage is dead.
So they picked up 11%.
47% saying that the institution of marriage was dead, or was not dead, my bad. And then 3% still being undecided.
Okay, so that brings the affirmative is our winners for the evening. Thank you very much. But I always love it when it's like a real scorcher at the end, because there's only a 1% difference between the two. That means that you guys just did a fantastic job. Thank you to all four of our debaters. Thank you to all of you again. Happy Valentine's Day. And yeah, Nathan? Oh, okay. Thank you very much. And yeah, join us for our next debate and follow us on UA Debate Series on all of our social media. All right?